Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How you doing, Zach?
I am good. This is a nervy time for us Americans.
Well, yeah, there is that. But on the plus side, you've been busy distracting yourself and
yes, that's right,
and educating people over at Reimagine Buildings Collective, which is up and running.
It is, and it has been really super fun. We did our first welcome event in the collective. We just did our first Ask Me Anything session. So Ed May was there for an hour answering folks' questions about passive house modeling and engineering. And we're about to, his course, the Zero to Hero PHPP modeling course, which is designed to train. By the time you finish this course, it's a 12-week course, so this is a significant course. By the time you finish that course, you will be equipped to model a building for a paying client. So that course is open, and will remain open for people to join this cohort until November 5th. Which has no relationship to the election that I referred to earlier, but it happens to be on the same day, which is bizarre.
It's a good distraction.
Yeah,
you could spend hours and hours just online.
Yeah, you could. Do you want to be on Twitter? Right.
Yeah.
Or do you want to be learning PHP? So that's
one of
really
those things
cool.
is useful.
It's an amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, Ed has just done an incredible job with that, so that's awesome. Also, we'll be rolling out a Woofy passive version of the course in a few weeks with a different cohort. So, yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's great. It's built on really cool software too, so that's been fun to start to really play with. Lots of badges you can earn and great group of people. So yeah, it's fun.
You should definitely check it out because I mean that's just one of the resources and courses that's in there. There's all of the other video content from Reimagine Buildings.
Yeah.
There's heaps and heaps of content. Plus, there are lots of opportunities to interact with people. It's a great hub. So it's a pretty amazing place. And just for the value of that course alone from Ed is pretty incredible. I posted about that this week because I know a lot of people head along to Passive House training, which is amazing. Like Passive House training is a really good building science course, but a lot of people are surprised that you don't actually learn how to use PHPP in the standard Passive House training. So this course from Ed is amazing because it actually teaches you how to use the tool, and then to be able to do that with Woofy Passive as well in the future is going to be great.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Yeah, all the recordings from the Reimagine Buildings conferences will live there in the collective, and members of the collective get free admission to future conferences. So the December 6th Carbon Storage Conference, for example. So anyway, I could go on forever about it, but it's been a lot of fun this week.
So there's a big banner on the passivehouseaccelerator.com website, and if you click on that, and that'll take you over to the collective. If you're not in there already, you'll be able to sign up and find out all the information directly from the regular Accelerator website. Awesome. Well, we better get into this week's episode because I've got a recording that I did with Lloyd Alter after he had got back to his home in Toronto after visiting Down Under, both here in New Zealand and also Australia. And I had a bit of a chat with him about what he'd been up to and his thoughts on the general tour. So we'll get into that. But before we do, we've got a few people to thank.
Indeed. Yeah. And delightful to have Lloyd on. It's going to be a lot of fun. Yes. So in terms of people to thank, a big thank you to our accelerator partner of the week. And that is Building Performance Architecture. So Building Performance Architecture is making our programming possible this week, including this podcast episode. So a big thank you. Also, a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thanks to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, and Source 2050.
All right. Lloyd Alter is no stranger to the show. A lot of people will have heard Lloyd speak or read some of his prolific articles. You can check out his Substack at Carbon Upfront, where he has captured a lot of, he wrote about a lot of his recent tour to New Zealand and Australia on there, plus other thoughts from around the place. A lot on Passive House, but also just carbon and some really great thinking and ideas to share and to digest there. So check that out. And there's lots of other previous episodes and content from Lloyd that you can also check out on the Passive House Accelerator. But this is my conversation to round out Lloyd's visit. We did have a brief catch up during the conference, the FINS conference in Wellington, but I wanted to reconnect with Lloyd after he had got back home, because from the conference, you're sort of in that buzz, and then he spent some more time traveling around New Zealand, visiting some other passive houses, some other people in the community, and then also hopped over to Melbourne. And so I thought it was a really good opportunity to get his perspective from the Northern Hemisphere on his impressions of how things look down here. So here he is. Here's my conversation with Lloyd Alter. So, Lloyd, really great to talk to you now that you're back at home in Toronto. How are you feeling? How are things back home?
Things are fine back home. I thought temperature being there right on the cusp between seasons, that it would be very similar in Toronto to being in New Zealand. And New Zealand was far colder than I expected it to be. I came back to 20-degree weather here and was quite pleased after freezing in Wanaka. And I was wearing everything that I owned when I was in New Zealand, everything that I took, I was wearing at once. It was much colder than I thought it would be. And
well, I think we often get these little kicks at the end of our winter when you get last little blast of coldness, and I think you might have experienced one of those.
Yes, I was staying in all of these places with no heat either. And a lot of these passive house designs are done without heating at all. And sometimes you feel that. Certainly when I was in Dunedin, I was freezing. It's like, I remember years and years ago when I was young and I would go to England, and it was before they had central heating everywhere in the UK. And even though I grew up in Canada where it's freezing in winter, I was never so cold in my life as I was in the UK, because you never got warm unless you went to the pub and stood in front of the fire. And I got a sense sometimes that it must be like that in New Zealand, and sometimes that, you just are cold for days. I don't know if I'm correct in that.
Oh, no, you are. And it's often people from overseas who describe that, because they're coming from climates that are colder than New Zealand and also have things like central heating, and then come here and say that they've never been colder in their life, even though our climate is temperate, is cool temperate, heavily influenced by a maritime environment as well. So, yeah, wet and cold.
But I was so lucky that the generosity. I mean, after I finished the conference in Wellington, I was invited to the South Island by 3 different people involved in the Passive House world, and stayed in 3 different buildings in New Zealand in the South Island, starting in Christchurch with Damien McGill, who is, I believe, is he an engineer? He's not an architect.
He's an engineer by training, yep, and Passive House consultant.
Yes, and started off staying with him, and he's a tremendous walker. I never walked so far, and he's a foot taller than I am, so I never walked so fast. And going all through Christchurch, we walked kilometers and kilometers every day, looking at buildings, looking at empty parking lots where there used to be buildings, looking at really terrible new buildings. Christchurch was quite a shock, quite an education. It's been sort of it was knocked so badly in the 2011 earthquakes, and it's a definite slow process getting rebuilt.
Now, I'm going to direct people to your Substack, where you've captured in a series of posts your trip right from catching the train here in Auckland down to Wellington, experiencing the Passive, or featuring as one of the main keynote at the conference, and then carrying on, as you said, to Christchurch, further south, and then on to Melbourne. You describe Christchurch as the city of missed opportunities. Disclaimer, I spent 8 years and experienced the earthquakes myself, and that's partly why we ended up here in Auckland. So I have an affinity myself with the city of churches. What did you mean by the city of missed opportunities?
Well, an architect there described it as that it could have been the first great city of the 21st century, and instead was the last city of the 20th century. That basically it's completely surrounded by really awful sprawl. You know, you just see this sea of black, complicated roofs that every single house has behind reverse frontage fences to arterial roads. So the worst of North American sprawl, bungalow sprawl. In the core, the buildings seem to have been, so many of the new ones, except for the marvelous convention center, I believe it is, that everything seems to have been knocked up in a hurry. If it's been knocked up at all, I just felt that there was not a great deal of let's sit back, let's think, how do we build a really good city out of the rubble here, rather than let's just take the lots we had before and the land we had before and the roads we had before and just put buildings on them really fast. This is not unusual. This is what's happened throughout history. In my article about it, I talk about that's what happened in London, where the king asked for all of these planners to give them plans after the Great Fire of 1660 to rebuild London. And what they did is they rebuilt it with the same medieval lanes that they had before, because just dealing with property changes and everything make it so difficult to change. Or the suburbs around Denver that burnt in the fire, so the Marshall Fire, they basically rebuilt the same 2-car garage suburban houses to not even the new building code, because the insurance companies said to them, no, we're not giving you money to build better than you had before. You can build what you had before. And I understand that a similar thing happened in Christchurch, so that the opportunity to build back a denser, more walkable city with more people living downtown seems to have been missed.
Yeah. There were issues with upgrading some of the existing houses, and that was largely to do with insurance.
Yeah.
And so the classic case were houses that were damaged but still standing that needed repairing, often needed new plasterboard put, and a lot of people were very, very keen to take that kind of once in a life of the building opportunity to put insulation in the walls, because most of these buildings were built, some of them in the 1930s. They had no insulation. They were just empty walls. So this was the perfect time to put insulation in there. But the insurance policies, a lot of them said that the funding was available to put back as they were. And so that was literally what was done. There are some, of course, technical issues to adding insulation into a place in a building where there wasn't insulation before, particularly when that building kind of worked from a moisture point of view by virtue of being very, very leaky. And when you put insulation in there, you introduce a whole bunch of other temperature gradients and vapor gradients. So you do, it's not as simple as just stuffing a bunch of fiberglass bats into a void. It does require some careful thinking, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be done.
No.
And also, as you rightly point out, it is a missed opportunity because it's not likely to happen again. You're not going to then rip into that nicely painted interior sometime in the future to fix that.
I did visit 2 passive houses in the suburbs that were lovely, where people had basically obviously invested their own money to upgrade them, including one fascinating one by Liam. I can't remember his last name. That's in 2 parts, like half of it, the main part of the house was built to the passive house standard. And then another wing of the house was not, because he thought, well, I don't need the laundry room to be passive house. I don't need the guest room that we only rarely use. And I'd never seen this before as a way of perhaps, controlling costs, that you do what you need, what is sufficient for your needs to live. And then if you've got other parts that are guest rooms or work rooms or things like that, leave them out of the envelope.
Yeah.
It was an unusual and interesting thing that at the time I thought this was a really silly idea. It should just all be a passive house. And the more I thought about it, the more as I always do, talk about sufficiency, about how much do you really need, that this was a case of saying how much passive house do we really need when that other stuff we're only using really only occasionally, like when a guest comes. Fascinating move.
Yeah, and that links back a little bit to your content that you spoke about at the conference, which was very, I recall there being a bit of talk about considering how much we need, how much stuff we need. And that was a bit of a theme, really, not just how do we make buildings perform as well as possible for their operation, but do we need a building in the first place? If so, how big does it need to be? And really thinking about what goes into the building. Do you see that as a bit of an emerging trend back home in your part of the world? Are people thinking about not just the operational, but also the upfront energy and upfront carbon?
Well, I think it is a trend. If it's emerging, it's still among a very small select group of people. Certainly, if you look at all the tract houses and all of the houses that are being built by conventional builders, everybody they still want square footage. They still want more square meters. When I looked at all of the houses in New Zealand and then further looking at plans for Australian houses, they were all, room after room of big bungalow with sort of wobbly walls and bay window projections and sometimes huge windows, that there's no sense of what is enough in most production housing. And ultimately, we can talk about efficiency until we're blue in the face, but efficiency, as the Australian philosopher Samuel Alexander says, efficiency without sufficiency is lost. If you don't basically put a lid on how much you're building, then you're still going to be using more energy than you should and more material than you should. And the thing that I've found with the good passive house architects that I've met in New Zealand and again in Australia is that they get this. They know how much trouble every time you do a bay window or a jog is, what thermal bridges it causes, what insulation problems it is. So passive house design has gotten much simpler and I think more elegant over the last few years when people are realizing the importance of the form of the shape of the building. And, Bronwyn Berry, the American architect, she has this game that she calls Spot the Passive House, which you just do a sort of a Google shot from above, and you can always pick out the passive house among all the other $1 million houses around it, and that they've got all the complicated roofs going over the place, all over the place. And the passive house is a simple box with a simple shed roof.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you picked up on the complicated roof epidemic. I spend time similarly looking at Google Map images, and you can just look down and you can tell that these roofs are designed by a computer program, because somebody's laid out the rooms below, often making the pantry bigger than it needs to be, or making bay windows and pushing things out. And then a computer just draws the roof around that with exactly the same overhang, regardless of where the wall is. So you end up with this massive number of ridges and valleys.
Possible to put any solar on.
Yeah, and it's become so easy to send that off to a frame and truss manufacturer who just
puts it in their computer.
Probably puts it in their computer, and it spits it out in a bunch of complicated trusses that are all numbered nice and easily, so they just get stacked up on site. I've talked to roofers about this, and they say, it adds lots of work for them, because they have to do a lot more flashing around all those complicated joints, and it wouldn't actually detract from the space below to vastly simplify that roof. And that's a really good point about the making it better for solar as well.
Yes.
Yeah, that I could probably talk a bit more about that, but we should move on. You also talked about passive house versus passive house, different spellings, different terminology that came up. There seemed to be a bit of enthusiasm from Passive House Institute New Zealand to follow in the wake of the Australian Passive House Association, which rebranded similarly to UK using the German spelling. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, I've been pushing for this for years. I've been writing about it for years. The Passive House was the stupidest name because it's not passive and it's not a house. And particularly in North America, where there was a movement all through the 70s to do passive solar, where you would actually have passive solar design was the name for making the whole wall of house glass and having the floor heat up, and sometimes putting in giant jugs of water to heat up or change state materials. And passive solar was a very, very big deal. And passive solar, there's the famous story of the Saskatchewan Conservation House, where Harold Orr and his partner Dumont, they were asked by the government of Saskatchewan in the middle of Canada to build a solar house. And they said, we have no sun for months on end, and it's really low, and it's like 40 below here for months on end. We can't do a solar house, and we'll give you a super insulated house. And they built what was really one of the pioneering models for the passive house. It had huge thick walls. It had relatively small windows with shutters because they didn't have triple glazing then. They even invented a heat recovery ventilator that was made out of sheets of polyethylene that the air moved through, that took up the size of a room. And then they studied it, and they studied it against a typical passive solar that was everybody was doing in the 70s, and just demonstrated with the math and with the reality on the ground that super insulation beats passive solar every single time. And so here you've got that. And so how do you then end up calling this new thing passive house, which is what it evolved into, when it was actually dead out competing against passive solar? It was, I think, a fundamental mistake right from the beginning. And I knew architects. The first article I wrote about it was this Toronto architect, very talented architect, say, I've just built this passive house. Look at this. And it had a glass wall and a trom wall behind it. And said, no, that's passive solar. So I think Australia did the absolute right thing. Kara Rosemeyer of, I believe, she's from Auckland, she said, and she's originally, I think, from Germany.
She's German, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lives north of Auckland now, up in beautiful, her own passive house up in Northland.
And she told me she thinks it's a terrible idea to change it to Passive House because there's a lot of sort of anti-German sentiment around, and people don't like the fact that they're necessarily buying something that is a German idea rather than a more local idea, which really surprised me coming from a German. But
well, the debates will go on. There is some enthusiasm there, so that's an interesting story to watch. You went on from Christchurch down to Dunedin. Now, Dunedin is quite fascinating. It's been a lot of stuff happened in Dunedin since you left, including a flood, which I'm not sure if you've caught any news of, but South Dunedin has been impacted quite a lot just in the last week. But you were there to see a co-housing project, and I also want to do a shout out to Tim Ross and a lot of the Passive House community down there, because they're kind of punching above their weight. They're for a relatively small centre, there's a lot of really good examples of building going on down there. What was your impression of the co-housing project?
Well, I have been a fan of co-housing for decades as an alternative model for delivering housing to groups of people. Instead of just going to a developer and getting whatever the developer sells you, these are people getting together and figuring out what they need and financing it and putting the projects together. And I've been consulting to people from way back from the days when I was an architect, let alone then became a real estate developer, where people were coming to me and saying, let's do these. They're incredibly hard to do, to get people together, to agree on everything, to get banks to lend you the money, to find people to build it, and to actually get it built on time and within a budget that you can do. So anyone who pulls off getting a co-housing project built in sort of the West. I mean, in Germany, they have a whole theory called Baugruppen, where it's actually very standard and everybody does it. But outside of Germany and Austria, you don't see it very often. It came out of Denmark, and in Denmark you can do it. But like in North America, it's almost impossible to do. And not only did he pull it off, they pulled it off spectacularly. Like, the buildings look great. They're built to the Passive House standard. They went through a value management exercise, as every project does, to take money out of the project. And I was surprised they kept the Passive House. And Tim said, yep, everybody wanted that. That was key. No Passive House, we're not going ahead. And so it's a remarkable achievement, architecturally, in terms of Passive House, and just given how difficult and how many years it's taken. And so it was, I think, a highlight of the trip.
Yeah, it was quite a journey. And I there's a fantastic presentation a few years ago that explains the emotional journey of all of the parties involved in right at the beginning of procuring the land, coming together as a community, working through all the consenting process, the design. It's not, I can see that it's not efficient, particularly the way we have in our legal system and our consenting and our property rights. There's so many barriers to delivering that, but you need, at the moment, some motivated people to push through all of that, and that's what they did. Achieved a really good result. The net ripple effect of doing that in Dunedin has been quite impressive as well, because the council has taken notice of their success, and it was one of the first places that asked for some social housing to be built with Passive House down there as well, as a result, I believe, of looking at this. And there have been a few other projects off the back of it as well. So it is really fantastic. I agree with the aesthetics, because I think a lot of people would drive past this and just see a bunch of modern, quite nice looking townhouses and have no idea that there's a whole community that's involved in that. I also want to pick up on it's interesting you say that the challenges of ownership. We also have another model which could be well suited to this type of building, and that's with iwi. And iwi own a lot of land, and they own that as a community. So there is potential for more of this type of housing with a more shared ownership, but still with private space. I think there's a lot of potential for this type of model to be rolled out particularly in New Zealand. So, yeah, I'm hoping. I agree. I think it's a great model. I like to see more of it.
I'm hoping that, everybody's talking about what do we do with all of our office buildings now. And I've been looking at some groups that are trying to do sort of co-housing office conversions. And I think that might be great because what they found there with buying a school site is that almost all new development happens out, in the country somewhere. And you don't want to do this. You want to be part of a community. Yeah. And they were lucky to find a school site that they could afford to get. In fact, the neighbors complained that when they were getting the approval, neighbors were complaining, oh, there are going to be too many kids around. And Tim would look at them and say, really? I mean, last year this was a school and you're complaining about there's going to be too many kids, or smells from the communal kitchen. It's going to smell up the neighborhood. I mean, fortunately, as you say, the town council was supportive and just blew all those ridiculous comments away. But those are the kinds of things that can kill projects. It's insane. Yeah.
And notably, that was also one of the places you stayed that didn't have a heater.
Right. It did not.
In that case, it was a good thing.
Well, it was such a lovely wake up in the morning. There's nothing better than waking up in a cold room when you've got a warm blanket on top. The only problem is, I had to get out and get in the road again. It's just so hard to get out of bed. But there was an electric heater in the room, a plug-in heater, and in seconds it would warm up the whole room. So, it's not like you freeze in the dark. There are things that you can do. And a fabulous heater in the bathroom. I don't know. I think it must have been sucking the electrical system dry because I just pulled that thing on and in seconds the whole bathroom was warmed up. So
yeah. I can't remember what their air tightness was, but I recall it was quite impressive when they did that a while back now. Now, tell us about Melbourne. What were your highlights?
Well, before I go to Melbourne, I was with Jessica Ayres staying in a straw bale passive house for the first
that's right. You went to Wanaka as well.
Yes. I went to Wanaka and stayed there in her house for 2 nights, and just all such lovely people in Wanaka. Went off to a bar one night and met everybody in the community there. Yeah. I saw the new community center in Luggett that they built to Passive House. It was just the friendliness wherever I went was just so spectacular, so impressive. And so Arthur Lee took me to a passive house that he worked on, that a pair of architects, their own house. They work upstairs, live downstairs in a beautiful over-the-top subdivision of multi-million-pound houses. And then showed me the project he's working on now, that he's taking all of his passive house training and working on social housing and beautiful little houses. They're not passive house, but they're very efficient, and a whole community that he's building.
Is that out in Arrowtown, that project that he's working on?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen some of those plans. Arrowtown's an interesting place because it's an old mining town, quite a small, I guess it was an encampment really, but has become quite a nice, quaint little town.
Oh, God, yeah, very, very trendy. The streets were hopping, and nice little houses.
Yeah, and there are some restrictions. That's actually one of the challenges that Arthur's facing, because there are some rules around the heritage values of that town, which make it very hard to do. But you can't do it in a big apartment block, basically. So right. You're stuck with quite small houses, and it's hard to make a very small standalone house be very efficient. So
right.
that's some of the design challenges that Arthur's facing. And he's also facing an issue which we see quite often, where he's come onto the project relatively late and is having to make the most of a less than optimal building form factor and general design.
Right.
And has really good plans for the next tranche. Hopefully he'll be involved at an earlier stage in the next lot. But that's always a challenge when you get brought onto a project late in the stage and want to try and make it efficient, but you're facing some geometric challenges.
Right.
But yeah, some really good stuff going on down in that part of the world. Some beautiful projects, and it's just a stunning part of the world as well in Queenstown, Wanaka.
Yes.
So yes, then went off to Australia.
Yes, just Melbourne. I'd originally planned on spending more time in Australia and less in New Zealand, but the hospitality in New Zealand was so amazing. Everybody kept saying, "Oh, come here, come here, come here," that I just kept squeezing at the other end. And Air Canada that I flew makes it so difficult to change tickets and so expensive that basically the only thing I could do was come back when I'd planned and just skip Sydney. So all I really saw of Australia was Melbourne, which again is, I think, probably the place you want to see anyway. I had happened to have old friends there. I have an old friend who became a teacher there and was asked to speak to not a passive house group. I was put together and it was a full house, 90 people. And so that was fun, basically giving much the same talk that I did in Wellington. And I have always, I don't know if you know his work because he doesn't do passive house work per se, but Andrew Maynard of Austin Maynard, who I've been writing about since I started writing, and I've always thought was the most interesting architect. So I got to spend quite some time with him looking at his projects, and he's a genius. He's great. And he's also very funny. So I was very happy to see that development. He's part of a whole group that did 6 buildings where architects each basically put together the financing and put together the design and built and sold the buildings. They all became architect developers, and such a fabulous model. And one of the founders of it was Nightingale, which when I was in Dunedin, he actually spoke. Jeremy, I forget Jeremy's last name.
Yeah.
He spoke there, but they've sort of split apart, and Maynard was building his separately from Nightingale, but following what's sometimes called that Nightingale model of sort of small-scale development.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeremy's come and presented to various conferences here, and a lot of people have looked at that, as you say, Nightingale model. My recollection of that is getting the developers out of the way and letting the designers and as much as possible, the future building occupiers have a say in what the building's going to look like and really designing around their needs, as opposed to what might sell in the real estate market.
Yeah, it's a nice middle of the road. Like, it's not co-housing where everything takes forever because every decision is by consensus.
Yeah.
There is a lead, and the lead is that in these cases the developer architect. And it's just something we need so much more of. You know, he makes the hard decisions about, well, we're going to not have parking, which makes it instantly so much more accessible and quicker. He made the decision, well, we're going to insulate it high enough that we don't need boilers and radiators and that, almost a passive house standard. They make the decision how it's going to look and what the unit mix is, and it's just great stuff, and there should be more like it. In North America, buildings all tend to be bigger because we have the requirement for 2 stairways and a corridor in between. So buildings are bigger, and there are parking requirements, and banks won't lend you money unless you've got money and you're a developer already. So it's just so much harder to do.
Yeah, yeah. And I think deprioritizing the car is definitely a big feature. I think there are some restrictions on resale as well. I recall something about if people do want to sell, just having a quick look here at the Nightingale page, the maximum resale price of the apartment cannot exceed the price that was paid for it, plus a percentage increase in the median house price of that suburb. So it the intention of that is to stop the sort of speculation,
Right.
or, we've just had an apartment building completed at the top of our road here, and as always happens, immediately as it's finished, a bunch of for sale signs go up, which
Right.
is generally people who have already bought, but they bought off a plan and they've put that down as a speculative investment and now selling straight away, hoping to realise a capital gain from just the existence of that property. And this tries to avoid that and focus on a quality community and quality housing,
Right.
not just people speculating and generating wealth in the real estate market.
I stayed in Melbourne. I stayed in a passive house. It's not really a hotel. It's a residence for members of the Nurses and Midwives Union, built on top of an historic hotel. And it was a mass timber and passive house. And the wonder of it is that I came away that, really every hotel should be passive house, because if there's one thing that you find, it's quiet. I wrote an article about this, the best night's sleep I ever had, because there's no noise. The ventilation systems, I've been in some so-called green hotels with through-wall units that are pumping out 80 decibels of noise when they're on, and I'm looking for the off switch in these hotel rooms because the mechanical systems are so bad. And then if you turn off the mechanical system, all you hear is the road in the corridor noise.
Yeah.
And here, just silence, just the most wonderful silence.
And did you say that was a housing for nurses?
Yes, it's the nurses for short-term stay when they come into town. So it's basically a hotel for nurses.
Which is fantastic. So much to like about that. I'm really interested in, we have this constant problem of conditions for nurses, for primary school teachers, people who often have jobs that don't pay very well straight out of university or college, and who require living often in quite expensive areas, close to work where it's hard to find accommodation. I'm really interested in solutions that help fix that and provide living arrangements for people who are doing those incredibly important jobs. So that's really good to see. As I said, I will link to all of those. You got some great writing, as you always do, on your various stops along the way. As a fond cyclist myself, I should also just quickly mention your blog on cycling around Melbourne. What do you think of the cycling infrastructure there?
Well, I had heard that it was good, and I was very, very impressed with it. I lucked into it that I signed up for a bike tour, and the guy giving the bike tour actually is a reader of my stuff. He actually knew who I was because I've been writing about bike activism for years. And so he gave me a wonderful tour all over on an e-bike, which helped. And I knew that it was going to be good because the friend I was visiting, who's a driver, said, "Oh, there's way too much bike infrastructure. It's really getting hard to drive here." And I always, when I hear that, I know, they probably just have enough to make it continuous and decent. And I found there were some areas of shared usage and down near the waterfront where there were no cars, but there were shared bike and pedestrian. And this did not work very well, especially now that we're in the world of e-bikes. And there were big stickers everywhere for the cyclists to slow down. And it wouldn't have hurt to have a little more separation there because it was such a busy pedestrian zone and you really were sort of winding through them. And I could see that as a shared use zone, it was going to be a problem. But Generally, I really enjoyed it. It was interesting that I was going to write that Melbourne is everything. It is bike lanes, it is scooters. And that very night, they removed every scooter from the entire city. That basically they just decided that electric scooters were too much of a problem and banned them. And overnight, they were gone. And I have trouble with that. I think that we have to have room for all kinds of micromobility, not just bikes and e-bikes, but scooters as well. And they just have to be managed properly. But I know this is a very controversial issue.
Did you go down Queen Street when you were in Auckland? I know you were here only very briefly. Did you go right in the CBD?
Yes.
Did you see the cycle lane there and the sort of shared pedestrian pseudo cycle path?
Yes, I did. And
I ride up there every day, and it's interesting. I constantly have to ring my bell to avoid people who are wandering across it, usually looking at their phones or completely oblivious to the fact that they're walking across something that might be a cycle path but kind of is a shared space.
Yes.
And then we have e-scooters there as well. And recently they've allocated parking spots, because one of the problems with e-scooters is people just leave them lying around, often in the middle of the cycle path. I don't know if that's going to, if a simple white line painted on the pavement is going to really fix that problem or not. But it's interesting to see cities grappling with this in different ways and coming up with different variants of how to put in places for pedestrians, cyclists, now scooters, and then sometimes four-wheeled vehicles as well. I don't think anyone's fully figured it out, although I know there are some fantastic models in Europe that have done a very good job of it.
Well, even in Europe, they've had real problems with it. And, but micromobility is the future. We've got to get people out of cars. We've got to deal with the vast number of aging baby boomers like me who are going to all want these little vehicles and ways of getting around, and their numbers in 5 years. Everybody gets the demographics wrong. It's not until people are in their 80s that they really start having these issues. And that's just beginning. The waves of baby boomers are just starting to get to that age. Where we're going to have serious conflicts in our roads with old people trying with strollers, going with micromobility, going with scooters, It's a challenge that people aren't addressing properly and that really have to start looking at very carefully. It can't just say, we're banning that. We've got to figure out how to make it all work.
Yeah. Lloyd, I really benefit from you being here. I really appreciate your time here physically. I know that we also benefited from people coming virtually. I think there's a bit of a tension there between physical travel and being able to jump on a Teams call or a Zoom call to present across the world. How many burgers are you not going to eat as a result of your flights?
Well, that was, I figured 11.4 I can't eat a burger for 11.4 years because everybody's talking. This is just as background. This is everybody's talking now about this concept of avoided emissions, and people in buildings are saying, well, I built it out of wood instead of out of concrete. Therefore, I avoided the emissions of the concrete, and I should get a credit for that. And one architect I know, he built this building with a massive concrete parking garage under it, but still, by playing the avoided emissions game on his mass timber structure above grade, he was able to say, my building's carbon positive. It's saving more carbon than it actually emits, which is a complete farce. And I used to say, well, it's like me going on a diet and giving myself credit for the chocolate cake I didn't eat.
Yeah.
And for when I went to New Zealand, I did a calculation about how many if I was a typical American who ate 3 hamburgers a week, which they do amazingly, how many hamburgers, how long would I have to go without a hamburger to compensate for my trip? And it came out to 11.4 years. of
Right.
promising not to eat a hamburger to compensate for the trip to New Zealand. And of course, everybody says, but that's ridiculous. That's stupid. And I say, look around. This is what people who do buildings are actually proposing. Avoided emissions. Oh, I didn't do this, so give me credit for it. And no, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you, Lloyd. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your insights. And as I said, I really encourage people to go and check you out. Sign up, subscribe to Carbon Upfront, because I find it hard sometimes to keep up with all your writing, but it's very engaging.
I'm having trouble.
You're quite prolific, but it's always interesting and always an interesting angle, and sometimes it challenged me to think differently as well, which I really appreciate.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, and we hope we see you back in this part of the world again. It sounds like you've got a few places you need to go and visit you didn't get to this time around.
Yeah, it's a shame. I'd love to get back and see more of Australia and, of course, be back in New Zealand. One thing, I learned a statistic yesterday that they overlaid a map of New Zealand on a map of the United Kingdom. And the distance, the whole North Island on its own, is bigger than all of Great Britain. Yeah. I mean, it just, you lay them one on top of another. And, when I got there, I said, I'll just hop on the train. How long can it be? And of course, it was an entire day to do the island, just as it's an entire day to do from Scotland to Edinburgh to London. It's a bigger place than people think. And it's just remarkable how different and varied and interesting it is.
Well, especially when you consider the UK has a population of 67 million,
right.
and New Zealand has 5. So, we tend to, we're particularly here in Auckland, we're concerned about sort of the increasing population and the city's growing, a lot of people coming to the city. But when you look at some stats like that and realise that we're very sparsely populated country at the moment, and I have also heard New Zealand being talked about as a climate refuge, which is already starting to happen. But I think we're definitely going to see that population rise quite dramatically over the coming decades.
Well, as you talking about those floods in Dunedin, and as they found out just recently in Asheville, North Carolina, that people were moving to thinking that was climate refuge, there's no such thing. That, we're not going to find any safe place anywhere from climate. We have to fix it, not run from it. Anyhow, last word there.
Very poignant last word. Thank you very much, Lloyd. Really appreciate your time. And that was Lloyd Alter from Carbon Upfront over on Substack, and a frequent contributor to various platforms, including the Passive House Accelerator. So you can check out Lloyd's work in lots of places. What are your thoughts, Zach?
Well, hearing Lloyd talk about his trip, it's clear that you Kiwis are a friendly lot.
He certainly thinks so. Yeah. I get that from Lloyd and Joe Seabrook occasionally pops up in LinkedIn reminding us all of how friendly he thinks Kiwis and Aussies are.
Yeah. You seem skeptical, though, a little bit. Do I sense that?
I feel like it's when you're traveling, when you're on holidays, you always have a little bit of a rose-tinted these wonderful places that you're visiting, because all you have to do is drink coffee and have a leisurely breakfast and then go out and see nice things. Yeah. So maybe skepticism grows the longer you stay.
Well, and Lloyd was getting the VIP treatment, I imagine, as well.
That's right. He got taken around and planning. I think experiencing the train here from Auckland down to Wellington, which again most locals would not do that train trip.
Yeah.
But then also catching up with some of the movers and shakers in the Passive House space, and getting a tour of lots of really good stuff. He's also not afraid to point out some of the not so great buildings from his point of view, and he was pretty open about that in Christchurch and the missed opportunity. A lot of Christchurch was leveled after the earthquakes in late 2010, early 2011. And there was a lot of talk about building back better and lots of ideas. There were even these, I remember, design competitions of thinking about, how can we really make more sustainable, more resilient building. But there were lots of challenges to getting that implemented, mostly to do with cost and also speed. People just wanted to get houses back. And a lot of the city has ended up being built back more or less in a similar shape. There are examples of really new, interesting spaces, but there are also plenty of not so great places. So I guess it's a representative form rather than being something that's incredible and amazing. So that's the missed opportunity, I think, that Lloyd was pointing to.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that all the pressures that are come to bear during a rebuild from a disaster. I mean, I think that's true at the Marshall Fire as well in Colorado, and so I think that there's both a sense of excitement about some of the passive house projects and buildings that have risen from the ashes, quite literally there, as well as a feeling of missed opportunity, like with some of the buildings that have gone up, just kind of the same as they were before.
Yep.
But it is like there's that urgency to get something built.
There's urgency. There's politics. There's cost. There's also, in the case of Christchurch, Christchurch wasn't seen as a seismically risky place. And so a lot of it was. There was surprise and there was uncertainty, and that is often adds complexity to any process or mass event like that, where there's a lot of uncertainty and people just want some certainty. And when that comes to buildings, a lot of that is focused on the structure. So there was a lot of effort put into foundations, which means lots and lots of concrete, lots of earth removal, lots of earthworks, moving stuff around. So huge amounts put into, okay, now we know that this land is not necessarily stable. We've got liquefaction issues, which means that whenever things shake, it literally turns to liquid. So we want to build back here because this is where we live. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to pour lots of concrete in the ground, and that was a lot of the early priority was figuring out how to do foundations to be safe in a future similar event.
Another example of a carbon iceberg, right?
Oh, it's a city of floating carbon icebergs. Now with floating, supported by lots of polystyrene and foam underneath it, and then mass concrete over the top. Yeah,
right. City of carbon burps.
Yeah, but some really great stuff on co-housing that Lloyd witnessed, and some really great stuff going in Dunedin, which has had a ripple effect. There's a couple of projects that have been quite successful there, and then others have taken notice of that, which is really great, including the council. And because of the political state of affairs for us at the moment, where we've had a bit of a swing to the right and sort of opening up to just leaving things to the market, I think that the current state of opportunity of leadership is coming from more local government. So I'm really positive about things like Dunedin City Council and Central Otago, where they've got Queenstown Lakes, where you've got some amazing people around that region, and Wanaka as well. So there's real opportunity, and that's kind of similar to what we're seeing in the States, where you've got this amazing stuff going on in places like Massachusetts, which are really taking lead. And I think that's where true leadership is going to come from before it comes from federal or national central government.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, obviously, the federal government in the U.S. is really important. And for example, the progress that was made during the Biden administration around the Inflation Reduction Act and, the pools of money that are available to support better building, all of that is really important. And building code is determined at the state level. So, and there's so much that can be done at the state level and the city level. So it is really important when there are swings in federal government to realize the power that we have at a more local level, and that and to maybe take that opportunity to really embrace it in a way that wasn't being embraced before, and still be able to make it feel to be moving the ball down the field.
Yeah.
So look, it's great to have Lloyd here. Really appreciate the fact that he's not going to be eating hamburgers for the next couple of decades in order to make the trip down here.
Oh, is that did he make that commitment?
No.
I imagine
he did. He did make the He made the comparison of saying how many hamburgers it was his flight's equivalent to, but then he was also very much pointed out that we shouldn't think of one being a substitute for the other. So he does have a blog article all about hamburgers and air travel. So you should check that out on his Substack. And it's really valuable to get that outside perspective, because we do get a bit insular when we live in a place, and having someone come in and critique, I think, is really useful to point out the good and the bad. And which Lloyd's not afraid to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's such a great presenter. But he's got the experience of being a lecturer, professor, teacher, and that really comes across. He's such a great storyteller, but also provokes thought and sort of puts some ideas out there and challenges the audience, which I really enjoy. And a lot of people, I think, really responded well to that when he spoke at the conference as well. So thank you, Lloyd. And we look forward to reading more of your articles online.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lloyd.
We mentioned at the top of the show about Reimagine Buildings Collective. There's a lot of stuff going on in that space. What else have we got coming on?
Yeah, right. So there's the course there that is the kind of the big new, the thing to take advantage of immediately, and lots of other stuff. So in terms of other events, we on October 31st will be joined by Partel for a Halloween edition of a component spotlight. Partel is going to be presenting Building for the Future, Achieving Durability and Energy Efficiency with High Performance Building Envelope Systems. And we're also gearing up for the Reimagine Buildings Carbon Storage Conference, which is on December 6th. So get that onto your calendar. And on Friday, we will have, so November 1st, we'll have a special Ask Me Anything session with Michael Ingwe on the collective. And Michael will be answering people's questions about all sorts of stuff around retrofits and design and passive house, as well as on how to land your first project and how to communicate effectively about passive house and building decarb. So what the other big thing that's happening in the community in November, of course, is that FIAS will be featured at Green Build in Philadelphia. So if you can make that trip and get to Philadelphia, it's going to be kind of an important moment in the larger passive house / passive building movement.
One of the most important moments in early November in the US, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's nothing else going on in the US on early November.
Yeah. Please vote for the sake of the world,
the planet.
Well, there's lots of really cool stuff going on. I want to reiterate just how amazing all the stuff is in the collective, not just the fantastic content from Ed and the training courses that are in there, but all these amazing videos. But just a really great place to hang out. There's some really good questions, and you get some one-on-one time as well, Zach. People can.
That's right. Book a one-on-one with me. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I can help. Like, get you connected with people and help you with whatever obstacles you're facing, or do my best to help you.
Yeah, which I think people should definitely make use of that. I had a situation just this week where I came across a product that was available in Europe, and I wanted to reach out to see if anything similar was available here. And that's the kind of thing that this forum I think could be useful for. That is sharing ideas and finding solutions to design details, that sort of thing. So jump in there, have a look. Awesome. All right. We'll be back again. I think we've got a components episode this week as well, but we'll be back again with another regular episode of Passive House Podcast next week. Thanks, Zach.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Great interview.